Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're going to take a look at building a REST API using MongoDB and node.js. If you've been following along with the YouTube videos that I've been putting out, you might remember that I recently put out a video that used Express Framework and MongoDB. This one's going to be very similar, except for instead of Express Framework, we're going to be using Hapi.js. In addition to using Hapi.js, we're also going to be using a validation framework called Joy, which happened to be made by the same creators as Hapi. Before we get into the core material of this particular video, I wanted to give a shout out to DigitalOcean, who's a sponsor of this video. If you're unfamiliar with DigitalOcean, they offer great services around managed Kubernetes, compute services, object storage, and a whole bunch of other great things. If you're interested in getting started with DigitalOcean, I do have a promo code to pass out. You would get $100 credit towards your service. You can go ahead and navigate to do.co/polyglot. Now, jumping into the core material of this particular video, you'll notice I do have my terminal open. It does have a particular shell. I'm actually inside my Docker container for MongoDB. In a previous episode, I did demonstrate how to deploy with Docker for MongoDB. That's not going to be the basis of this particular tutorial. Instead, I'm actually going to open up another tab in my command line, and we're going to go ahead and start by creating a new project. So on my desktop, it doesn't really matter where you do it. On my desktop, I'm going to create a new project directory. I'm going to call it something along the lines of, let's call it Hapi MongoDB. Doesn't really matter what you call the directory. Go ahead and navigate into this particular directory, and we're going to say npm init-y to initialize our node.js project. After we have our package.json file created, we can say npm install, and we're going to install Hapi, we're going to install Joy, we're going to install Mongoose, and we're going to say ---- save. So we do have all of the packages that we plan to use available to us. And if you're unfamiliar, Mongoose is an ODM that makes it very pleasant to work with MongoDB and JavaScript, even though that Mongo is pretty easy as it is. So let's go ahead and clear our terminal, and we're going to create a file. You can create it through the terminal, or you can create it however you feel most comfortable, but I'm going to say touch, and I'm going to say app.js. And this app.js file is going to contain all of our application logic. So let's go ahead and open it. I'm going to say Atom period, and it's going to open up in my Atom editor. If you're not using Atom, if you're using Visual Studio Code or something else, that is absolutely okay. It's whatever you prefer for your editor or development environment. So let's go ahead and open up the app.js file, and let's start importing those dependencies that we downloaded. So I'm going to say constant happy equals require happy, constant joy equals require joy, and then constant mongoose equals require mongoose. So very easy so far. I'm also now going to initialize our Hapi.js server. So I'm going to say constant server equals new happy.server, and I'm going to pass in some options for the initialization process. So as far as the options go, I'm going to pass in a host. The host in our case is going to be localhost because we're going to be testing it locally. And I'm going to define a port. I'm going to define it as port 3000, and that's it. If you wanted to, you could specify CORS information or various other things related to your server inside the configuration as well. The next step is, well, maybe we want to start serving our application. So I'm going to say server.start, and if I ran this in my terminal now, I can say node app.js. It would run. It wouldn't do anything. We don't have any endpoints to hit, but it is the first step towards our project. Now, as a convenience, we are going to install one more package. This is going to be a development dependency. I'm going to say npm install nodemon --save dev. And if you're unfamiliar with nodemon, it's just a hot reload application. So every time we make changes to our application, it'll just go ahead and restart it for us. It'll save us. It'll give us a convenience of not having to do this manually, which when developing an API, it will definitely save us some time. So I downloaded it. I'm going to go to package.json. I'm going to create a new script. This time around, I'm going to say start is going to be my script. I'm going to say the start script is going to be nodemon, and then I'm going to tell it that I want it to watch the app.js file. And I'm also going to zoom in on this just a little bit, so that way it's a little easier to see. All right, so going back to the app.js file, the next step is, well, maybe we want to start defining our MongoDB connection. So let's go right below the server, and let's say mongoose.connect, and we're going to pass in a URL for our MongoDB instance. So I'm going to say MongoDB localhost. I'm going to provide it my database name, which I have already created in my MongoDB instance. So it's going to be the polyglot developer. That looks good. We are going to be working with a single collection, just like we saw in the Express Framework tutorial. So this single collection is going to be around people. And for that reason, we're going to need to create a Mongoose data model. So we're going to say constant person model because we're going to be working with people. We're going to say equals mongoose.model. I'm going to call this person. And inside of this model, we're going to define what fields can exist. And this isn't going to offer us any kind of crazy data validation. We're going to be using Joy for that. But we're going to say first name. It's going to be of type string. And we're going to say last name, which is also going to be of type string. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our endpoints now. Since in theory we don't have any data in the database as of yet, it might make sense to do a create endpoint. And we will be doing full CRUD, so create, retrieve, update, and delete. But let's go ahead and start with a create. So we're going to say server.route. And we're going to define some options here. So we're going to define the method. This is going to be a post because we're creating data. We're going to provide a path. So we can access this endpoint at person, singular, since we're only going to be creating one person at a time. We're going to have a handler. This is going to be asynchronous because we will be working with async and await, just like we saw in the previous example, to save us from having to work with promises and callbacks. So this will definitely help us. It's modern JavaScript. But we're going to say request. And then this is the Hapi kind of configuration variable, which will allow us to do custom responses, among other things. All right, so now we're going to say try because we want to catch all of our errors. We're going to say catch. If there's an error, what we're going to do is we're going to say return h.response. We're going to respond with the error, and we're going to give it an error code. In this case, we're going to give it a 500 error. But assuming that everything is successful, we're going to say var person equals new person model request dot payload. So the payload is the request body. So when we make our post request using Postman or something else, we're going to submit some JSON. This is going to be that JSON, so the payload. After we have that person, we can say var result equals await person.save, and then we can return with that data. So return h.response result. It's going to default to a 200 code. Now, in theory, this is good. This would work. If we provide a first name and last name, it'll be fine. But there's no real data validation happening as of now. So let's go ahead and add some data validation with Joy inside of Hapi. So we can go ahead and add another option here. We can say validate. Actually, we can say options. Validate. Let me add a comma here before I forget. But we have validate, and we can choose what exactly we want to validate. We can validate the params, so the route parameters. We can validate the payload. We can validate query parameters. In this case, we only have to worry about the payload. So we're going to say payload, and we're going to say first name. So how we want to validate the first name will go as follows. So we're going to say Joy has to be a string, and it is required. So the Mongoose model, it just has to be a string. It's not necessarily required, but we're requiring it with Joy. The next step is, well, Let's go ahead and validate our last name. This is also going to be a string, and it's also going to be required. Now, this is just very, very, very simple validation right here. This does not do justice to joy. If we wanted to, we can say, you know what, the first name has to be a minimum of 3 characters. We can do likewise with the last name. We can do regular expressions. We can do a whole lot of different validation as part of these properties. But it's totally up to you. I definitely encourage you to read the documentation, but this is more or less the configuration on how you would do it for each endpoint. So I'm going to save it, and we're going to see what we're left with. I don't think I'm currently running the application. I am not, so I'm going to say npm run start because we have our nodemon script. So with that done, let's go ahead and open Postman. This is how I'm going to test our APIs. So with Postman open, we can change our request from a GET request to a POST. We can enter in our URL. So localhost port 3000. The endpoint is person. That's our path. If we wanted to, let's go ahead and maybe just send it as is to see what we end up with. You can see invalid request payload input. That doesn't necessarily help us. I mean, we know because we're the developer that we forgot to include the first name and the last name, which is required. But to the end user, this is probably not helpful. What we can do is we can make some modifications to our code to actually be more specific in what the errors say. Inside of validate, if I wanted to, I can say, what's the fail action? This is part of Hapi. So we're going to say fail action, request, H, error. And what's going to happen is we're going to say return. We're going to say error dot is joy. So is this a joy related error? If it is, then we're going to say h dot response error dot details. So the first array, because it's going to give you an array of all kinds of craziness. We only want the first, and we're going to say dot take over. Otherwise, we're going to do something else. So that in this case, it's not necessarily a joy error. So we're going to do something else. We're going to say h dot response error dot take over. And like I said, there's potential for 2 different types of errors on what would cause your endpoint to fail. We're just basically looking to see if it's a joy error or something else and returning the error message appropriately. So I'm going to save it. We can go back into Postman. We can run our request again. This time we have a more descriptive error. So in this case, value must be an object. We're not passing anything in. So let's go ahead and pass something in. We're going to just say this is a JSON payload. It's going to be empty. Now it says, you know what, first name is required. We're not looking at the last name or anything because we're only looking at the first error. So let's go ahead and say, you know what, first name is Nick. And then let's go ahead and say last name is Raboy. I'm going to send it. And this, you can assume now that as of now it's inserted because we have an ID for our document inside of MongoDB, and we have the data that we inserted. So you just saw how to kind of work with our validators here. Again, they're not too complicated. They're actually very powerful if you get familiar with it. So it could make your life a lot easier. So we do have the first endpoint created. Now we probably want to take a look at, well, how do we access that data? So let's go ahead and create another route. So server.route. Add a semicolon there as well. Let's go ahead and say the method this time is going to be a get method. The path, we want people, plural. We want to get all people. We want to now say, what is our handler? What's going to happen when this endpoint is hit? So we're going to say handler. We're going to say this is async request h. So same kind of setup. And let's define what's inside of it. And just for convenience purposes, let's go ahead and copy what we had above because we can recycle a lot of it. So let's go ahead and remove the first 2 lines here. Let's go ahead and change that to var person equals await person model dot find dot execute. And what we're saying is, you know what, we're not passing in any kind of options. We're just doing a generic find, and what that's going to do is it's going to return all documents from that person collection. So in this case, in theory, we'd only have one. I think I have a few records already inside of this particular collection, but we're going to find that out. Instead of result, we're actually going to return person, or if we really wanted to, this could be plural. If we wanted to follow along accurately and have good code. But I saved it. Let's go back into Postman. I'm going to change this to people. I'm going to change this to get. I'm going to send it. And as you can see, yes, I did have other records in there, but now I have 2 documents that I've returned. And this body is ignored because it's a GET request. Now let's look at our next endpoint. So this time, you know what, maybe we will only want to return 1 record rather than all of them. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to change it up a bit. So our get endpoint, this time it's going to be person, singular, and we're going to pass in an ID, so a route parameter. After that, we can change this line 57. So we're going to be looking for a particular person. We're going to say await. We're going to say person model. Now, if we wanted to, we could do a similar query to what we had on line 44, which would be find, and we can pass in the ID as a parameter. But instead, it kind of makes sense to do a find by ID instead. So we're going to say request. We're going to say params.id, and then we're going to execute it. And then what we're going to return is we're going to return the person that was retrieved in that particular query. So let's go ahead and go back to Postman here. I'm going to copy this ID, and I'm going to change my get endpoint to person. I'm going to pass that ID as the route parameter, and I'm going to hit send. And as you can see, it only returned 1 record now. It's no longer an array. So moving along, we're doing pretty well with our API. The next step might be to update documents. And again, to save us some time, I'm gonna do a copy here. So this time around, an update is usually a put request. We want to update a single document, so person makes sense. Also pass in an ID that also makes sense. But we also need to make some changes now. So let's go ahead and start by doing the handler, and then we're going to add some validation logic. So let's go ahead and wipe this out. And we're going to figure out what we want inside this try. So we're going to say var result equals await person model dot find by ID and update. So this is a little different than what you saw in the Express framework tutorial. I actually did this in 2 steps in that particular tutorial. First I did a find, and then I did a set. But Mongoose actually has a command that'll let you do both of this in one operation in your JavaScript code. So it's totally up to you in what you want to use. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. We're going to say, you know what? We're going to pass in the request.params.id. We're going to pass in the request.payload as the data that we want to update. So we have the ID, what we're finding by, we have what we're updating, and then we have options. So we're going to say new equals is true. So if this is new properties, we're going to create them. And as far as what we want to return in the response, we're going to say return h.response, and we're going to return the result. Now, that is good and all, but we kind of want to do some validation. We would rather not just say, you know what, are these strings or are these potential actual fields inside of this model? We could do better. So we're going to say options, and we're going to do more or less what we saw previously. So we're going to say validate. We're going to be validating the payload. We're going to say first name, joy.string. Instead of required though, we're going to say that this is optional. And this is totally random what I'm doing here. Don't take this as a serious form of validation. Joy can be very serious, but for this API example, we're not being serious. So in your production app, you're probably going to want some much more strict validation rules than what we have here. But for the last name, I'm also going to make that optional. And we're also going to be a little more specific in our fail action. So we're going to say fail action request h error, and we're gonna do the same thing. So I can actually copy and paste it. So again, we're going to check to see if this is a joy error versus not a joy error and respond appropriately. All right, so that's our update. So let's go ahead and give it a shot. So I'm going to go back into Postman. This time around, I'm going to look for my record. I'm going to look at my ID here. I'm going to change this to put. I'm going to change this to person. Pass in my ID. Go look at the body. This time around, I'm going to say Nicholas, my full name rather than my nickname. And I'm going to say send. And this time around, it looks like it worked. We can validate it. We can go to query all of our documents again. And you can see that it's no longer Nick, it is now Nicholas. All right, so we have one more endpoint to do. This would be delete. This would complete our example for CRUD. I'm just going to copy this endpoint here to save us just a little bit of typing. This is going to be a delete method. I'm going to have person and then an ID. We're going to change this up a bit. So for the logic, I'm going to say var result equals await person model dot find by ID and delete. So likewise, just like with the update, in the express example, I did it as a two-step. So I did a find and then I did a delete. But in this case, you can see that I'm doing this with a single command. So I'm going to say request.params.id, and I am going to return that result, which is basically just going to say that it's deleted. So I'm going to save it. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. I'm going to go up. I'm going to copy. Let's go ahead and copy Maria. I'm going to change this to person, paste in that ID. I'm going to change it to delete, and I am going to send it. It looks like it was probably deleted. Let's go ahead and do a get here. And you can see that now there's only one record in that particular collection. So going back to look at the code here, we did quite a bit, although it's not, if you take into consideration what we tried to accomplish versus what we actually coded, this is actually very slick. And when I write APIs, I generally like to use Hapi versus Express because Hapi feels like it's better equipped to handle APIs. So we connected to Mongo, we defined our data model, and we created each of our endpoints independently and defined the validation logic. However, everything inside the handler functions is more or less what we saw in the Express example, with the exception that some commands, I use different commands because Mongoose does allow for these kind of concatenated commands versus doing them in a multi-step process.